Good morning, ministers, state secretaries, ladies and gentlemen. We have just 90 minutes, so we have to be well organized, very eloquent. We simply have to start as soon as possible. I would like to welcome our panelists, and first of all, Mr. Minister, State Secretary, the floor will be yours. You just came back from United States, so there are fresh impressions, and I believe that these introductory remarks will help us very much to warm up and to start our discussion. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, 2019 is an important year for the North Atlantic Alliance. It's an opportunity to look back at the past 70 years of NATO and 15 years of Slovenian membership. The occasion is even more important as we discuss the ways and the means of how we will continue to fulfill our transatlantic commitment to freedom, security, and our shared values. The global security environment has changed. The events of 2014 have been a wake-up call for all of us. Emergence of new threats is a reminder of the importance of a strong transatlantic bond. The need for NATO, ready to respond to challenges in 360 degrees, remains strong as ever. As Minister of Defense and former Minister of Foreign Affairs, I had the privilege and responsibility to closely follow the adaptation of the alliance for most of our 15 years of membership. I still kindly remember the successful NATO ministerial meeting held in Portorož in 2006. These experiences confirmed my strong belief that our decision to join NATO had been and continues to be of vital national importance. NATO played an important role in professionalization and development of our armed forces and defense system. Collective defense has become core of our national defense. As member of NATO, we have been able to do more, do better, and most importantly, work hand in hand with our allies. We recognize the importance of defense expenditures and investments. We value NATO cooperative efforts, which are a good example for our unity and resolve. Framework nations concept is a particularly valuable tool in that perspective. A clear dedication to common efforts and sharing of responsibility is seen also through Slovenia's substantial contribution to NATO missions and operations. Over 6% of our armed forces currently serve abroad, mainly as part of NATO efforts in Western Balkans, Latvia and Afghanistan. The alliance has made a long way in the past few years. NATO today is stronger, more responsive and ready to confront all challenges from any direction. Our Euro-Atlantic family has grown and we continue to keep our doors open. I'm particularly happy to welcome to this panel my good colleague, Minister Čekerinska. I look forward to soon welcome North Macedonia as the full-fledged member of NATO. North Macedonia and more recently Montenegro are perfect examples of how we actively support NATO open door policy. The Euro-Atlantic perspective has proven to be a true driver of change, particularly in the region of Western Balkans. As we discuss future challenges such as hybrid, cyber, terrorism and new global actors, we have to keep in mind the founding principles of the alliance. NATO had continuously changed and adapted, but its core objectives remained the same. To sustain NATO's global leadership in the years to come, we will need to find answers to some difficult questions. I'm confident that the meeting of NATO chiefs of defense in just a few of days in Ljubljana will be an excellent opportunity to exchange opinions, ideas, and views on current issues and matters of common interest. Ladies and gentlemen, strong commitment to collective defense, peace and security, and shared values are the most powerful tools of our alliance. This is why I remain confident that NATO is and will remain the strongest military alliance in the world and the best possible source of stability and security for the Euro-Atlantic region. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister of Defense Karel Erjavec. NATO is a political and military alliance, and this alliance has a very clear political program. Open door policy is one of the most effective tools for the stabilization of not just our continent, but with the different partnerships. It also contributes very much to the stability of much wider area. Open door policy is happening for decades. There was many anniversaries concerning enlargement of NATO. The very first one was in 1999, when happened the first wave of 3, today, how to say, the most experienced new member states, Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic. Then it was a next boom 15 years ago. Then Slovenia was in that package and all the Baltic states. Then Croatia came, Montenegro, and we are all desperately waiting for the NATO summit in December. And we hope that at that time we will be 30. On one hand, we have Brexit. EU is somehow reducing, if I may say so. I have to speculate. It didn't happen yet, but it might happen in a nearby future. But what we are much more proud of is the fact that North Macedonia, the government of North Macedonia, the Vice Prime Minister and the Defense Minister Radmila Šekerinska is with us today. So I believe that your perception, your motivation, your endeavors are very important for us to understand how important it is to continue with open door policy.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you, dear colleague, Minister of Defense, ladies and gentlemen. On this issue, going down the memory lane, I think one can really decide whether to be a frustrated pessimist or, the usual Balkan optimist. When you spell out all the timeline practically of who entered NATO when, I could say that we have a lot to be frustrated about. We have lost not only the opportunity 15 years ago, but also the big opportunity in 2008, when we believed that it is a done deal. And I think that this gives every one of us a lesson of how opportunities are rare, and if you don't seize them, they just disappear. But this time, again, I choose to be an optimist and to say that time and again, we have shown that the right level of political commitment can really contribute to an immense change in a very short period of time. Just 2 years ago, my country was a source of worry and concern among most NATO and EU allies. We have been struggling through a difficult political crisis with decline of democracy, significant decline in media, and even aggressive political confrontation. Nevertheless, it took a new government, of course, a lot of political determination, courage, and decision-making to actually spin these things around and to actually expect a good news at the London summit. Last year, we were invited to join NATO at the Brussels summit immediately, just a bit more than a month after the breakthrough that we have done with Greece on a dispute that appeared completely frozen. And if someone was doing bets in the Balkans, probably the certain bet was that this conflict will remain frozen. And there is no political mathematics, there is no political leadership willing to take the risk. We have actually made breakthroughs in several areas. We have solved our open issues with Greece, but we have also tackled our open debates with Bulgaria. In the last year, North Macedonia was among the top 5 countries in the world with regards to an increase of media freedom and peace and stability, which I think sends the strong message that democracy and freedom of media do not undermine our stability if we get it right. And it was not just the political environment that changed. It was not only the political environment around us and with regards to NATO. For the first time, we have had practically 3 elections in a row in which ethnicity and religion are not the dominant factor. And as a result of this political turnaround, I do believe that this was the main reason why we have managed to quadruple our FDIs, and we have created more or less 50,000 new jobs. So it is a success story. But this success story was possible because it was not only us that seized the opportunity, it was also the alliance that seized the opportunity. In times of doubts, in times of big divides within the alliance and among members, I think that NATO sent the same message, that it is there as a political alliance that supports good neighborly relations, solving regional issues and promoting stability by improving the political ties between the countries. So I think it was a win-win situation both for North Macedonia but also for NATO. And I don't think that it is a coincidence that so many countries have quickly ratified the agreement. Here we are in Slovenia. We especially appreciate the support that we have received before the invitation, but especially after the accession treaty was signed. We are very hopeful. We know that the timetable is very ambitious. What took Montenegro more than 18 months, we hope to achieve in less than 10 months. There are many unknowns. For example, the situation in the UK, also whether the Spanish government will be created or they'll go for elections. So these could all delay a bit the process, but the big news was that NATO did deliver. And I do hope that, although we are talking about the alliance, the good news is that it looks as if member states of the EU are prepared to take forward the same agenda and to reward the signals of progress in the Balkans. I liked yesterday very much when I heard that B could stand for being bold for the Balkans. I do believe that we need to be really bold. When I entered the Ministry of Defense, I had to do a lot of reading, so you read a lot of Clausewitz theories, and there was one big message, that if you want victory, you have to make sure that you have bold thrusts, maneuver, and speed. So I really think that the time has come for us to say we have shown very speedy recovery, very speedy process, but the time has also come for the EU to show that speed recovery and speedy progress results in speedy decision-making. It wasn't as speedy as we hoped for or expected, but October could be an opportunity also for us and for the Union. Thank you.
It was 3 years ago when the initiative appears to start direct cooperation between NATO and European Union. And in these 3 years, a lot of things happened. I'm really glad that we have today here with us Pedro Serrano, who is a Deputy Secretary General for Common Security and Defense Policy and Crisis Response in the EEAS, European External Action Service. At the same time, he is now a head of transition team, waiting for a new High Representative, Vice President of European Commission. And as Radmila just said, there are challenges in front of us, not just concerning security and defense, but also the open door policy. North Macedonia is now ready to speed up the process. I would just like to remind those of you who maybe don't know, Radmila Šekerinska was dealing with EU accession before Republic of Macedonia at that time was stopped in Bucharest on Bucharest summit. So it's time to speed up, to push, to do it faster and to deliver more, what would be extremely important for our continent, for the role of European Union, not just in Europe, but much wider. So we have common challenges, and I believe that Pedro Serrano, Mr. Pesco, is the right person to continue our debate. Please.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. A real honor to be here, ministers and secretaries of state and colleagues and ladies and gentlemen. And I feel very honored to be speaking on a panel that has no EU title. It's just referring to NATO. And I think with this, a very clear message that I want to leave with you is that EU and NATO work well together, need each other, and need to strengthen further the relationship. Maybe that would be my main message. But we're in the Balkans, and you've made different hints at me on the processes of enlargement, and you know very well the position of the European Union on this. We have committed ourselves to a future where the Balkans will be fully included within the European Union. I think that's the path that we're heading towards. It has always taken a bit longer, and because we have had also examples in the past to join the European Union than to join NATO, but this is also because we are very different organizations, and because the requirements to join the European Union are much more, with all due respect to my NATO friends and colleagues, but much more complex than the requirements. It requires a legislative alignment of policies that is no way comparable to what needs to be done on the NATO side. And what is important is that all countries that are joining the European Union will be in such a state that they will be contributing to the strength of the European Union. But it doesn't mean that there's not commitment. Quite the contrary, there's very strong commitment. And I think from our viewpoint, since we're talking security, I think there's no doubt whatsoever that there will not be a secure and stable Europe until this process has been fully finalized. And I have to say, if we look at the big challenges around the world, we do need a very strong and stable Europe in order for us to be able to face more effectively the challenges of the outside world. And I think that's so for us as well in the European Union, this process of the integration of the Western Balkans is equally important, and we're very much aware and working on it with our Western Balkan partners to make it advance and to continue along those paths. But coming back to NATO, and you mentioned it, Mr. Minister, it's the strongest ever, probably, military alliance. I would say the longest living military alliance, certainly today, and it has grown stronger. And one of the reasons why it has grown stronger, and it has been able to survive many different changes in the geostrategic environment. You know, we started with a bipolar world. Where are we now? Very far away from it. But one of the main reasons why it has survived, probably, it's because what unites the members of the alliance as the European Union is the common values. It's defense of democracy, it's defense of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And this is what's driving us forward in our common agenda. And we have seen the strategic environment changing dramatically in the last years. And we are no longer certainly a bipolar world. We're in a world where geostrategic competition has restarted in a complicated manner. But we see how national crises are having regional impacts, and regional crises are having tremendous spillovers in world affairs, bringing terrorism and other phenomena very far away from where they originated. And the nature of threats has changed as well. And now this is not only purely military nor interstate conflict that we're handling. We are handling hybrid threats, and I think that's one of the main concerns that most of us have at present, that come through cyber, that come through disinformation, that come through threats to the economic and industrial base of countries. And this, and terrorism, of course. And this requires a very complex mixture of instruments. In reality, two main consequences of the new strategic environment, I would say. The North Atlantic area is not the only area we have to look at. Actually, we have to look much beyond that, and actually NATO is looking beyond that, and certainly the European Union as a global player is also looking beyond that area. We have to look at Africa, we have to look at Asia, we have to look really way beyond the North Atlantic. But also the challenges, we have to look beyond military. And here's where, in both issues, the European Union brings enormous added value. And NATO, as the European Union, needs partners. Actually has very nice partnership for peace, but it needs partners beyond that. And I would say that the European Union is the most natural and most important partner of NATO, and we also consider NATO one of the most natural and important partners of the European Union in terms of security. And it's natural because we're based also on values, the same values that NATO is defending. It is also because we have the same even origin. We both come out of the ashes of the Second World War. And this, I think, also unites us in what we're trying to achieve. And NATO and the European working together are a formidable force for stability and peace in the world. And I think that would be, and we have, which doesn't mean that we have to be complacent. I'm not entering into the challenges, maybe the debate will bring us there, but they're formidable, the challenge that we're facing in our direct neighborhood, in the overall geostrategic competition. And here, this is where the joint declarations that gave birth to the new relationship between the EU and NATO, starting in Warsaw in 2016, continued declaration in Brussels, identifying key areas for cooperation that I will not enter into detail, but that cover from exercises and operations, practical work, working with partners, industry, development of defense capabilities, cyber and hybrid. These are the areas really of our cooperation. And I would say that these joint declarations have overcome and gone way beyond Berlin Plus arrangements at the beginning. Maybe I have to cut down I see your looks, and I will stop here, and then very glad to enter further into detail in what is it that we're doing in practice in all these domains. But many thanks for having me, and keen to be here and to discuss with you all these issues. Thank you.
I appreciate very much that you are following the body language.
Unmistakable.
Yeah. It was 70 years ago when NATO was created, but the main message when we celebrated our 70th anniversary was a gathering in Washington, D.C., where there was a common session of Congress and Senate, and our Secretary General, Stoltenberg, was spreading a very good message, very strong message. The message was, it's good to have friends, even today. And it is good, even for the United States, to have friends. These remarks I will use to introduce the next speaker. Is Dr. Damir Črnčec, State Secretary in the Office of Prime Minister of Slovenia. He's an expert on long-standing in the field of national and international security. Prior to Slovenia's accession to the NATO alliance and the European Union, he headed the Security Department of the Intelligence and Security Service of the Ministry of Defense. From 2005 to 2012, he was the Director General of the Intelligence and Security Service of Ministry of Defense, and from 2012 to 13, he was a National Coordinator for the Fight Against Terrorism, Secretary of the Council of National Security, and the Director of the Slovenian Intelligence and Security Agency. So he is the right person to say something about why it is good to be a friend, and Slovenia is trying its very best to be a friend to all of you. Please, Damir.
Thank you, Jelko, for this nice introduction. Good morning to everybody. I'll try to focus a little bit more on Slovenian perspective rather than broader NATO issues and questions that were already tackled. And of course, I can in Q&A sessions then maybe go into depth also there. Firstly, I want to say that I firmly believe that NATO and European Union were both the different sides of the same coin. And with PESCO initiative and all the agendas that the European Union is pushing in this direction in the field in defense and security, I still see this in this way rather than that there is a conflict, competition in this negative way or something like that. Secondly, I'm deeply convinced that for Slovenia, NATO has been the cheapest insurance policy. Security, as we all know, is a precondition of everything, of social, cultural, economic development. And we are seeing this, of course, in the area of Western Balkans that was already mentioned today. So if there is no security, then there is no prosperity, as simple as that. In Slovenia, we tend to forget that after 2004, when we joined, because before we made a lot of efforts into our defense security system, but afterwards, especially after 2009, the economic crisis hit Slovenia quite severely, and we also dropped investments into this area. And coming from the government that is going to have a first year jubilee in 2 weeks' time, I have to say, and I have to stress this very strongly, we start renewing the renewing process of national security strategy documents. The ministry is working very hardly on the white book, and to put where our words are, also some concrete actions we delivered in the money sense. You all know that Slovenia defense expenditures are dropped severely in recent years, and now with the rebalance in 2019 and with the budget that is going to come soon in the parliament, we are going to start delivering also, not because NATO wants to do it, or forces us to do it, because we realize ourselves that it has to be done in this way, that the plans we developed 10 years ago has to be redeveloped, replanned, and the first precondition of everything is to have investment process or cycle restarted again. And we are doing this, we are very strongly committed to do it, and this is the main message I want to spread among the audience here today, looking at the NATO and Slovenia being 15 years a NATO member, an active NATO member, as Minister already mentioned. Slovenia is on the peak, not just this year, but the whole cycle from 2004 on the military troop contribution to the NATO crisis operations. More than 5%, at some time we have even 7% of Slovenian military being abroad, being deployed in the different operations. Out of those, 85% of those troops are in NATO missions. So the 15% goes to UN and to European Union. With that, I would kind of close my opening remarks, and I look forward for the future discussion.
Thank you, Dami. Our next panelist is coming from Estonia. Sven Sakov is coming from International Center for Defense and Security, which is a foreign affairs and defense think tank based in Tallinn. By the way, by basic profession, he's a historian, so I intend to ask him some historical questions. He is organizing also the Lennart Meri Conference on annual basic. That is an annual Baltic conference on defense, and publishing Diplomatia magazine and running Estonia National Defense course. He's a well-known figure in not just in the Baltic, but much wider. What I want to use as a starting point is a yesterday interview broadcasted on our national TV late night. She was asked by a journalist about your area inside of the Soviet Union. On Sunday, it was 80th anniversary since the beginning of Second World War, which followed by the occupation of Baltic states. And Madam President reacted immediately. She said, no, we were never part of Soviet Union. We were occupied. It was not our wish, it was not our will. We didn't do anything for that. We were just occupied. And I believe that this remark is quite provocative for some people here in the audience, and I believe that it is a good starting point for you, Sven, to deliver your messages.
Thank you very much. I'll be reclining back so I don't see the moderator's body language. Madam President of Estonia is, of course, very much right. If you want to irritate an Estonian or Latvian or Lithuanian, tell them, oh, you are a former part of a Soviet Union, or that you are a former communist party. You know, really, I mean, after 30 years, we hope not to be known and remembered for some forced arrangements or occupations what we had to endure. This is actually a very peculiar year, 2019, because it's a year of anniversaries. Just a couple of days ago, we commemorated, looked back at the start of the Second World War, a bit further. On the 23rd of August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, and hence Soviet Union and Nazi Germany became allies and started the Second World War. Basically, 1st of September, there was a German attack on Poland, followed by, on the 17th of September, Soviet Union attacking Poland from the back, and then dividing the nation. And on the 22nd of September, Nazi Germany and Soviet Union had a parade together. So this is basically how the Second World War started, and followed by Soviet attack on Finland and occupation and annexation of the Baltic states. An occupation which actually lasted until 1994. So just a couple of days ago, again on the 31st of August this year, we celebrated in Estonia 25 years since the end of the Second World War for us, because that was when the last of the Russian troops, or ex-Soviet troops, left finally the country. And of course, we also have the 70 years from the inception of NATO, which has been one of the cornerstones ever since of a current international world order, especially when it comes to Europe. But also 1989, 30 years ago, that was the annus mirabilis, basically, when a very large part of the European continent became free again. So what have we learned actually from 1930s? What I think we have learned is that first is appeasement does not work. This is not appeasing the aggressor, but actually gives more fuel to its machine. So nowadays, looking at, I would say, a growing efforts by some of our dear European friends to find, quote-unquote, off-ramp for Russian in order to start again a new reset, forget about the past and move forward, I think we should think back to 1930s. And of course, the other lesson learned from 1930s is the old si vis pacem para bellum, because a lot of European powers, I'm referring to Chamberlain in the UK, tried to wish the war away and did not prepare. So, many, many years later, where we are in terms of the lessons learned from 1930s. Look at the record what we have. In 2008, in August, Russian Federation attacked Georgia. It's still occupying 1/5 of its country's territory. It took just 7 months for the reset button to be handed over by Hillary Clinton to Sergei Lavrov in Geneva. What did Russia learn from it? After a couple of months of bad weather, you get over, and everything's going to be back to normal. You can attack your neighbors and nothing really happens. When we look at when, are we serious about defense in Europe? Unfortunately not. In 1989, basically 30 years ago, the average defense spending when it comes to Canada and European members of NATO was around 3% of the GDP. It dropped below 2% 10 years later at around 2009. And it was at the lowest point in 2015 at 1.42%. Now we all celebrate this kind of new rigor of NATO, money is pouring in, so forth. And in terms of a net aggregate, in terms of GDP percentage, we are now at 1.55%. Not that much, basically, has changed. And quite a percentage, or big part of that, is actually coming from the frontline states, especially, of course, Poland, because Poland is a big country in terms of a defense investment. Now, where is NATO at 70? I mean, I think it's usually referred to that this is a NATO 4.0, the first being the Cold War classical one, the second one being the 1990s, the partnerships, basically stabilization operations in the Western Balkans, and then everything changed in 9/11. That was a NATO 3.0, waging war, counterinsurgency operations far away from its territory. And now after Crimea, we have NATO 4.0. What is quite similar to the change in NATO thinking after 9/11 and after Crimea is that suddenly pundits, experts, politicians had developed a clear sense of clairvoyance. They exactly knew how the future is going to be. After 9/11, it was all about asymmetric threats. Nothing else mattered. After Crimea, it was all about hybrid. Nothing else matters. I'm not sure really that this will be the case, and I will come back to that a bit later. I think now we need to think a bit on what will or could NATO 5.0 be, what it will be about, especially when we look at a world which is changing in terms of a power balance. And when you look at the world from the perspective of Washington, D.C., I think there are two things you need to bear in mind. One is that Washington tries to first manage the rise of China, and second, manage the decline of Russia. If you compare those two tasks, the former is by far much bigger challenge for the United States. And I think now the question is whether Europe is relevant in that American generational kind of, I would call it struggle, but it's a too strong word, a challenge, and whether NATO as a consultative forum might be of use for that. I think there are some ways where we can actually see that might be happening. For example, Mike Pence was now yesterday, the day before, in Warsaw, and the US and Poland signed a joint, I think, declaration on the 5G issue, which I think is something what maybe NATO should be looking at. And of course also, I think NATO should be relevant, become relevant in space, not just because this is a domain of warfare, but also because this is increasingly important for the United States. And the United States has always been NATO's cornerstone and the pivot around which every other NATO nation actually forms. Now, when I said that clairvoyance on everything going to be hybrid might not be the case, what I'm referring to is that Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service is publishing a yearly assessment of security situation, which is a very interesting reading because actually intelligence service is publishing a yearbook assessment, public one. And this yearbook was really interesting. You can see it online if you Google Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service assessment. And it says that basically it starts with quite a bold claim that that service has surveyed and followed all Russian military exercises in the last decade and has drawn 4 conclusions from it. Conclusion number 1 is that Russian Federation armed forces are preparing for a war against NATO, seriously preparing. Conclusion number 2, Russia sees a possible war between itself and NATO to be coming from or stemming from so-called colored revolution at Russia's doorstep. It does not specify exactly where, when, and so forth, but in that yearbook or assessment, There's a lot of talk about Belarus, for example. Third conclusion, drawn by the service, is that the Russian side sees that war to be waged in the Baltic states. Not because it has something to do with the Baltic states, but because that is where Russia is predominant militarily. It can do things it cannot do in other places. And the last conclusion is that the war, from Russian perspective, will not be then constrained to the Baltic theatre, but will involve long strikes far into the western part of Europe. And why it really matters, and you know, I'm really the only person here in the panel from the north, is that when you look at the just basic geography, the Baltic states and Poland have 967 kilometers of border with Russian Federation. And if you add to that the Russian ally Belarus, you add another 1,268 kilometers. So, you know, a long land border. The Baltic states is where Russia is strongest, NATO is weakest. Where Russian forces are where they should be, NATO is far away. Where basically Russia is enjoying time and space advantage. So what should we do? Wrapping up. First is really, we should get serious about the defense investment in the whole of Europe. I can say that Estonia has been serious for the last approximately 10 years. Estonia reached 2% already before Crimea, not after. When we look at, and I don't think that NATO is necessarily serious enough when you look at the challenge. NATO has 4x30 initiative, you all know, NATO Readiness Initiative, whereby one of those 30s is 30 days readiness. So why do we assume that we have 30 days? When Russian Federation is organizing the snap readiness exercises, which start immediately, and immediately, pretty much immediately, 100,000 troops are on the move. And NATO is looking at readiness level of 1 month. So basic investment, readiness, and I think the third is deterrence, in-place deterrence. And what we miss in Estonia right now, and Latvia and Lithuania, is presence of, unfortunately, American troops. And this is not that the current arrangement where the Brits and the French are in Estonia is not sufficient as such, but I think I want Kremlin to know that the US troops are in Estonia and will be involved anyway, and there is no negotiation about that. There are no ifs and buts. And of course, as a last point, I think my advice for Europeans would be not to talk rubbish about the European army type of things. Because we need to remind ourselves that we are, you know, in nowadays world, always one tweet away from dissolution of NATO or irrelevance of NATO. And I don't really want to wake up one morning and see that President of the United States has said, well, you know, this is what Europe wants. Europe wants to be alone, wants to have its own army. Here, please. Thank you very much, and we are leaving. And I think in that case, we'll be in a very, very different world. And if you haven't read already, my favorite book of last year was Robert Kagan's The Jungle Grows Back. It's a very dense and very good book and gives you a good idea of what it means if the current world order and the security order will break down in Europe, and that would be catastrophe. Thank you much.
And that was really a wake-up call, an alarm clock from the north of Western Europe, which in this sense includes Finland and Sweden as well. Now we will move to Central Europe, because Robert was a founder of and the president of GlobeSec, a Bratislava-based think tank committed to enhancing security, prosperity, and sustainability in Europe and throughout the world, will continue. So we have just heard the assessment from the intelligence, but now we need some assessment from the NGOs and definition of future, or let's say present and future threats for common security and defense on our continent.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation, and I'm very happy to be part of this excellent panel. We have 9 speakers, so I will try to be very brief in my points. I have 3 points, and they will focus on the future, because definitely NATO now is the most successful alliance in the history. But in order to stay successful in the upcoming decades, we need to focus on the issues of tomorrow. And we have to prepare for the war of tomorrow and not for the war of yesterday. And here is the few challenges that NATO is facing from the strategic and long-term point of view. Number one, I would say, is technology. We have to recognize that we live in a very exciting times of a major technological revolution. The technological revolution now is exponential. It is altering almost all parts of our life, how we communicate, how we make decisions, how we socialize, how we vote, how we do business, and many other things. But these are also changing the nature of conflict and the war. Vladimir Putin recently said that who will first develop the general AI will rule the world. Well, that is not the battle of in the decades. That's the battle of today. Because we see the investments in the artificial intelligence that are increasingly big in China, in Russia. They are in the US, but this will be the new domain of the conflict. So we will soon see that our old capabilities, big heavy steel equipments, will be outdated. And we need to prepare for the war of tomorrow. So I think we have a generational mission that we go out of this change and revolution in a stronger way, not in a weaker way. We have 3 problems with it. Number one, often these new technologies are developed in private sector. So we need, in the West, a better public-private cooperation in order to be able to harvest the potential of these technologies. Number 2 is there is a danger of increasing gap between the United States and Europe. As US is investing a lot into artificial intelligence, in Europe we are still just at the beginnings. There is a danger that in a few years' time our capabilities will be very different in Europe and the United States, and we will not be able to work together as we do now. And the number 3 is the procurement process. The change is so fast, and our decision-making process and procurement process is so slow that it takes 4, 5, or 6 years to get a new technology into our capabilities. Well, in 6 years, that technology is already outdated. We need to have a different approach because we will lose our advantage right now. So we have to deal about that. This was one of our major recommendations in the NATO adaptation initiative that GlobSec has conducted with a number of heavyweights from both sides of the Atlantic under the leadership of General John Allen. And one of the recommendations was that NATO should establish a center of excellence on artificial intelligence to understand what is the new potential, but also what are the new threats coming out from this technological revolution. Number 2, these are the hybrid threats. The conflict is moving to new domains. We do not have any more the comfort to react only to one type of threat coming from one direction. We have to react to hybrid threats from multiple directions, multiple actors, not only state actors, and multiple domains in multiple domains simultaneously. What is new is that also these new technologies and these new domains are accessible to our adversaries and to new actors. And they are well coordinated and used very efficiently by our enemies to undermine us from inside. And that leads me to the third point, which I would say is the major threat to NATO for the future, and that is of political nature. We are living in a time of massive disinformation and massive influence operations across Central Europe and NATO as such. We have to remember that the goal of disinformation is not to win the argument, but to confuse people and decrease the trust in the system and decrease our ability to react. So we can build the best capabilities. We can invest 2, 3, 4% of our GDP to our armies. If we will be unable to decide on the nature of threat, and if we will be unable from inside to make proper and fast decisions, our enemies and adversaries will win. So I think our democracies need to be treated as a critical infrastructure, and we need to protect them heavily. So this political nature and the spread of disinformation I consider as one of the biggest threats that we need to work with all together with the governments, think tanks, and the society as such. And let me just give one more additional point in the context of the discussions about Brexit and about the stronger European defense. I think that Europe's goals should not be the de-NATOization of the European defense, but rather Europeanization of NATO. We need more European investments, but we don't need less of NATO. And we need to also remember that with the Brexit, we would be losing in Europe with Brits 25% of European capabilities. So we need to make sure that the Brits are an integral part of the European defense scheme. So these quick points, and we can come back to any of those in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is coming from Switzerland. He's Scott M. Weber is a specialist in peace building and conflict prevention, and is the president of Interpeace, an international organization for peace building. Initially created by the United Nations in 1994 and headquartered in Geneva, Interpeace supports locally led peace building initiatives in more than 21 countries in Central America, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East and Asia. In January 2018, Interpeace was officially recognized as an international entity by the Swiss Federal Council of Government Ministers. This acknowledgement reaffirms the important role played by the organization in peace process worldwide. So we don't have just panelists coming from the North, from Central Europe, from the Western Balkans. We have a panelist from the Alpine region as well. So Scott, please, take the floor.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and thank you to the government of Slovenia and to the Bled Strategic Forum for the invitation to be here. We are just celebrating 70 years of NATO, indeed. But as we do that, I'm reminded of what Kofi Annan said at the Munich Security Conference several years ago, where he was reflecting on the fact that the reason why we feel like we're on such shaky ground today is that we know that the old system no longer works, but we don't yet have the new system. And I think the challenge of our time is to figure out, well, what are those new forms of multilateralism? What are those new forms of cooperation that are going to be needed to manage the changing world? The panel has been talking about all the various types of changes that we are experiencing, and yet we're trying to readapt now 5.0 systems and organizations that were created 70 years ago to be the solution to these new challenges. So, to take Kofi's advice, what are those new systems? What are those new reflections? The fact is that the nature of risk is changing. The nature of conflict is changing, as Mr. Serrano said, as several panelists said. And whereas some of the members of NATO are looking east as the main source of risk, others, particularly Southern European EU countries, are looking at the south. They're looking towards Africa as the major risk in the future. So there's also divisions within the membership about where is risk most acute. But I would say that the greatest risks that we are facing, and the last colleague said it very eloquently, is actually an internal one. Internal conflicts, internal fragmentation, internal stability, internal mistrust within countries is making them vulnerable to then foreign intervention, to terrorism, to all sorts of risks that we then have to deal with through NATO or other tools later and downstream. Which is why I want to focus for a few minutes on the fact that I think NATO is critical, it's important, but insufficient. And we need a stronger Europe, even though Europe is challenged internally, but we need also new forms of creative solution building and multilateralism to be able to solve these problems. And to look to NATO as somehow in its fifth iteration, 5.0, to borrow my colleague's phrase, is I think a mistake, because NATO sees the world through a militarized lens, let's be honest. And yet, the challenges, most of the conflicts that we deal with around the world have at their origin some form of exclusion, political, social, or economic exclusion, and the sense of injustice that that creates within a country that then creates the instability where people take up arms or they confront each other violently, and then it becomes a basket case or becomes a grounds for terrorism. But at its origin, it's because of the internal fragmentation within countries. So the solution is not military. The solution is not a military solution. So we need to look at it through all these other lenses as well. What do terrorists, we work in places like Libya, Somalia, what do terrorists and pirates, we worked on the piracy issue in Somalia greatly, mainly through our Somalis on the ground in places like Puntland. They look for the communities that are somewhat divided or fragmented within. They integrate those communities, create greater instability within them. They might orchestrate an assassination by one group of another, and in the chaos, they take over the dynamic. That's their modus operandi. They look for the weak spots. They look for the countries that are unstable. That's why, as our colleague said, the disinformation campaign in Europe is so much of a central threat. Why? Because they're sowing internal instability that then becomes something that in the chaos, various actors are able to take. It's the same lesson in some of the villages in Libya in which we work, or Somalia, as it is in parts of Europe. I'm French. We're seeing this happen in France. We're seeing this happen across Europe. So the issue is, and I wanted to seize on the Deputy Prime Minister's very wise words about seizing the opportunity. Don't miss the timing. The timing that we have to seize is prevention. How do we seize these moments early on enough when we start to see that a country is starting to fragment within, to actually enable the resources for prevention to take place, real prevention work? And that's the part of the equation, the complementary element to NATO. The EU is playing a critical role in this, but it needs to do more as well, is how do we actually invest more in prevention? This whole debate around the budgets of NATO member states is a distraction. It's important. I'm not saying it's not important, but it's a distraction. Look, the US spends $500 million a year on marching bands within the military. That's the defense budget of Slovenia, more or less. Marching bands. They spent $20 billion the other year on air conditioning. So it's not a question of not having enough money. It's about where we're putting it. And NATO is a solution after there's great chaos and instability. But how do we actually prevent that more upstream so that we don't have to use NATO as much, for example? That's going to be one of the critical questions, I think, for NATO going forward. But it's about seizing the opportunity for prevention. And that we are not doing. And we know that $1 invested in prevention saves $16 downstream of costs. So the cost efficiency issue is obvious to everyone. That's not in question. The problem is that even in the EU, and I quote Margot Wallström, the Foreign Minister of Sweden, who said recently that for the first time in the EU, we have member states who actually don't adhere to the core values of the EU. You know, again, the challenge is internal. Again, the challenge is one of internal fragmentation within our alliances, within the UN Security Council. We had a brief window of cooperation within the UN Security Council, but that was the exception. If you look at the history of the UN Security Council, it's always been one of stagnation and confrontation in the UN Security Council. It's not a degeneration of the situation as much as it is going back to some form of previous normality of dysfunctionality. So we can't count on these major old tools to come back to Kofi's point. We can't rely on the tools that were created after the Second World War to solve our problems today. We have to be creative, we have to go beyond, we have to complement, and we have to invest in prevention. And especially, and this is my last point, is that, I was at NATO headquarters recently, trying to talk to them about the lessons of what the US, another report, my colleague was saying, must-read report, the Estonian intelligence report. Another report that everyone in this room must read is the US's SIGAR report, the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction report. Fabulous, 500 pages, it's quite long, but it basically, the military in the US has come to the conclusion that the military means of stabilization actually undermines stability. They're the ones saying it. It's not us peaceniks trying to do political negotiations who are saying it. It's the military who's saying it now. They've come to this conclusion. My goodness, let's listen to that. Let's listen to the fact that they recognize that that is not the solution to the challenges that they are actually trying to address. And think about what is the implication of that for NATO for going forward, and especially for what we need to complement it. And the last point is that we have to stop seeing the needs in the world through a risk lens alone. We have to start looking at it through a resilience lens. And the EU has played a leadership role, as some of us have tried to as well, on trying to shift the thinking around looking at, well, what are the strengths of society that you can build upon? Not just where is it weak and fragile. No country wants to be called fragile, right? But what are their internal sources of strength that you can boost that will keep things together, that will keep things from degenerating, rather than looking at them as a risk case that we have to somehow address their internal risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last panelist is coming from North Macedonia. Emir Hasanovic will speak on behalf of Young Bled Strategic Forum. So I'm not talking about his present occupation, what he is doing there. He has a special task here to remind us about the perception and priorities of young generation. So please, take your floor.
Thank you, Your Excellency. When I was first nominated for this panel, I accepted it. I said, sure, I'll talk about NATO. I like the sound of my own voice. That's no problem. But then I saw the list of participants, and there was a deep sigh, and I said, okay, what is it that I can contribute? What is the unique vantage point that I can offer among such participants? And then I started thinking, I'm half Bosnian, half Albanian, live in North Macedonia. What is it that I can provide that is a unique perspective? And anecdotally, for youth in this region, one thing in common is that once you get to a certain age, in your late 20s, you start feeling certain social pressures. One of the most frequent questions is, well, when are you getting married? When are you having children? And we've always found a way to, through humor, brush that question off. It used to be, well, I went to university to meet someone, but I ended up with a career and a passion for what I do. I'm sorry. But now the joke to that is, well, with the rate of climate change, is it really worth having children? And I think that, a generation manifests a cry for help through, thinly veiled humor and cynicism. And I think that is something we need to pay attention to. So what does this mean in this context? If a generation is thinking that way, we need to adapt to that reality that is almost imminent. NATO as an organization has prided itself in being adaptive and always finding an answer to the ever-evolving challenges of global politics, and that has held true in many historical moments, with the effective enlargement in key historical junctures, with the recognition of the cyber domain as a new domain of operation in an era where unprecedented threats started threatening our own democratic systems, and so on and so forth. And even in the recent communiques of the NATO summits, which I had to memorize by heart when I was working for Ms. Šekerinska, we always had principle-based recommendations for free press, for media, for rule of law, for democratic principles in states which reflect the liberal order and values of the NATO alliance. But I feel like that nuanced approach needs to be applied to a priority which can no longer be ignored at panels like this, and the heavy breathers can no longer look the other way. This is a security priority, this is a security concern. The demographic shifts that will ensue after catastrophes, whether they are in Siberia, whether they are in the Amazon rainforest, whether it is the glaciers melting that are rising the sea levels. The repercussions and ramifications of all those events will be the security challenges of the future, and we cannot ignore them. And this is not something that cannot be done. This is not something that I'm pioneering or something that requires a lot of drawing board material. Look at Slovenia. Yesterday, I was very, very impressed by the concerted efforts of the entire Slovenian state in recognizing the environment and the protection of the environment and sustainable development as a priority on all levels. That is not very difficult. We must reflect that in policy. And I'm not lobbying for Slovenia. In fact, Slovenia is lobbying for my generation. They're speaking for me. So I think, and look, I'm not a naive person. I understand the multidimensional chess that is behind getting something like that as a top security priority. I really do. But, in order to play multidimensional chess, you need a board. And when the board is on fire, politicians can't play. Then we'll have to find acrobats who will play on that board. So I think, we have to take this into consideration. We have to be preventive so that when my generation is sitting on these panels, we don't ask, well, why didn't we talk about this when we could have done something? Why didn't we put this on the agenda when there was still enough maneuvering space? Well, on behalf of BSF on this very warm September morning in Bled, I would like to urge all of you to take the environment into consideration when you draft policies. And despite the very pressing concerns that all of you have on your mind and the dense political agendas that dictate every step of your day, you have to think about us. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it took us 1 hour and 10 minutes to make just one round of interventions, and we have a long 20 minutes more. So what we can do in these 20 minutes, I believe that we have time for a short reflection of each of panelists. It was a lot of wise messages spread around. And I believe that there are things that we can add to what was said so far. But before that, let me say a few words because, as you see the title, NATO starts the story. I just came back from NATO when I was permanent representative for 4 years. And all of you do not deal with NATO. That's why I need to say something. NATO is, I underline for the second time, is politically and military alliance. It is first of all politically alliance. The main decision maker is North Atlantic Council. There is no military inside. Military committee is extremely unhappy because we politicians do not allow them to exercise what they believe. We don't allow them to use military glasses to solve the political issues. We just have a hard tool available in reach, in real time, to intervene if needed. What we are focused on is to deter. That's why we have a permanent enhanced forward presence in Baltic states, in Poland. In future, we might see our troops in this deterrent role somewhere else. But we need to be future-oriented. if we want to anchor and to stabilize our states, our society, and not to allow to destabilize them. That is my contribution. But now, Radmila Šekerinska will have a chance to send, again, the strongest message. Why the enlargement of NATO is so sexy for some countries. What can bring them, and what North Macedonia can contribute us for our more predictable and more stable future. Radmila.
Thank you, Ilko. We have, unlike Emir's generation, my generation has grown a bit old, waiting for the sexy option, but that's our failure. Let me say that sometimes we tend to expect too much, maybe, of the alliance. The alliance will never be the silver bullet of all our problems. Although it is definitely a family of like-minded countries that believe in similar values and expect similar standards, it's not only about the political and the military decisions they might come about. It's the fact that they are at the same table, discussing the issues that, when you are sitting back home, appear to be touching only you. I have heard a lot, as usual, today about the hybrid threats and about the weaknesses in our own societies. And this is something that we tend to see as our domestic crisis. But in essence, when you start hearing, comments from all other countries, you see that there is a very clear blueprint. And I fully agree with you. Unlike the typical military challenges that are there, but do not threaten us so directly, it is the divisions, the fears, the fractures within our own society. And if you go back in history, and there are historians here, you'll see that no single big empire collapsed because of external pressure. It was always the internal pressure. And when I go back and I remember, some of the books on ancient Rome, the typical sentence would go that Rome was never actually destroyed by, the different tribes around it. But it was the fact that when Romans stopped really contributing to the Republic predominantly, and when they felt that a bit of games and a bit of food is enough, this is when the Republic and the Empire was gone. And it does ring a bell. If you analyze the situation in our societies, the manipulation of the populists with regards to providing especially the poor with basic standards, but also a lot of reality show, gladiator fights, the entertainment without substance, you'll see that we are, I think, manifesting the typical signals of deterioration from within. And unfortunately, there is no NATO committee that can help us with this. But it is a discussion that we should conduct among, as I said, like-minded countries that went through this. Some countries have seen it happening maybe 10 years ago. Some countries are seeing the blueprint in a very visible manner. Sometimes the malign influences might be less visible in certain countries, but they're definitely very visible in my country. And this is where I think NATO and EU have not only a role, but really a responsibility to play, to actually look at the card, look at the map, taking into account all the elements, not seeing everything through military lenses, not seeing everything through hybrid lenses maybe, not undermining economic grievances, which I fully agree. We have missed them in many countries, including much richer than my own. If you read the statistics, you'll see that in North America and Europe, the developed part of our world, 1 of 4 millennials believes that democracy is not a good option. And it is an increase of 100% compared to the previous, let's say, my generation. This is, I think, alarming. People throughout Europe are losing faith, not only in their institutions, but in all individuals who are representing them. They are increasing the support to strong men. Usually it is strong men, somehow never a strong woman. And this is really undermining the essence of our political life. And this is where I think NATO could provide us with the hard hard power, but it should be the link with the EU, with the discussions about also climate change and economy and shared prosperity, where we can actually twist the situation and turn a corner. Thank you. And I didn't even mention North Macedonia. But although the comment, I take into account the comment that getting into the EU is absolutely not the same as getting into NATO. This is why there was a big several-year difference in all countries, including Slovenia. But what we are talking about is not North Macedonia and some of the other countries getting into the EU, but actually starting the very difficult, sometimes divisive process of reform and change called accession. And this is what shaped countries, including Slovenia, into better performing, climate change aware nations that we now admire. Thank you.
Thank you, Radmila. Republic of Macedonia and North Macedonia was spending years in the waiting room. That's why you see the mindset is ready. This is the mentality of EU and NATO. So it will be a little bit easier for Pedro Serrano to continue. But I just want to remind you that we have less than 15 minutes and there are still a few panelists that would deserve to have a floor.
I'll fly through my reply. And I really enjoyed the panel, and I thought that many of the interventions were really very much to the point and thought-provoking. Security and defense is not military only. There's an important military dimension, but it is clearly much wider than that. And just to give an example, last week we had the informal defense ministerial in Helsinki. What was on the agenda? Artificial intelligence, hybrid challenges, climate change, and security, and then maritime, which is an interesting dimension as well in the last years. That is the agenda of ministers of defense today. And it is an agenda that is not purely military. There are very important civilian elements, and some of you have referred to how many of the issues that we now look at defense have a very important civilian angle, are developed in the civilian and private context, and we have to see how we integrate that. And I think that's what the European Union does bring as added value also to NATO and its relations. It's all the capacity to mobilize all these civilian instruments. It brings other things as well, and diplomacy and whatever, but it brings that as well. By the way, this discussion in Helsinki was held with NATO and the United Nations, and some of you have referred to the importance of multilateralism. And indeed, the need to go beyond. This is not something, the world is not going to be solved by NATO and the European Union. You need to bring broader constituencies, and certainly multilateralism and the UN at its center and other big regional organizations will be key in helping all this move forward. Just to finalize, saying that mobilizing all these civilian instruments or civilian-generated instruments with the defense angle is a very complex task. It's very complex internally. It's very complex at an EU level. But we are moving in that direction. Finally, some of you have also underlined the importance of the internal fortitude of states. And I think that is a key issue. We see it as well. We see it in the EU. We see it at NATO. Some of you have linked that with disinformation. And certainly that is a very important issue. But I think we have to be even more honest about it and look at what our societies are, how they're developing, and assuming our own responsibilities for that development beyond the disinformation that may help internal tensions but they may be feeding on fragilities of our societies that we have to be able to understand and to tackle upfront. Thank you.
Thank you very much. State Secretary Damir Černičec, in your studies, you devote particular attention to the issues of protecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. So this is something what it is all about our values, which we need to protect and, if needed, to defend. So what can we do to be more effective and more persuasive in this direction?
Thank you. I will try to a little bit comment or blend in the presentations that we hear today. And I would say if you look at the map of NATO and if you look at the eastern flank, then we see that, and I thank Estonian colleague for that, and the Estonian perception or Baltic perception of threats, and for them it's quite simple. So it's imminent military threat deriving from the east. When we move down to the Central Europe, we are seeing what a colleague was actually addressing in the third point, so-called fake news, disinformation as a part of hybrid campaign, as a major threat. And probably this is also, that could be the easiest sell in Slovenia. And when we move down to the south, and I'm speaking about NATO member states, of course, when we move down to the southern flank of NATO, we are seeing that the second biggest NATO member state is buying S-400 systems, which is just totally opposed to the perception that is in the Baltic states. And all those three things are the main ways or the fields that NATO planners are going to have to take into account how to address the future. As simple as that. I try to simplify it, but that's it. We talk about technology, artificial intelligence, all these nice, very nice words. And you mentioned, of course, human rights, values, etc. And we are seeing also, I wouldn't be so harsh as some colleagues said, I think from the Switzerland, that there are some European Union countries that have problems with the fundamental rights or values of the European Union, but I see this within some NATO member states for sure. And this is the environment that we are in now, and there are some questions or issues that we don't really want to talk about them. And Jelko, you know very well this, being a NEC member, and you know all about what I'm talking. I was not so direct, but I think I was direct enough. Secondly, I want to mention one thing which is tied to Slovenia. And I will show you one empirical case. So in Slovenia, as you all know, we had a double referendum in 2003. Prior to that, there was a Djindjic assassination in Serbia, and this basically also helped to the results of the referendum. But at that time, I remember, because I was part of that, I was working in military intelligence, we were doing the vetting process, classified data, etc., all this preparedness program for joining the NATO at that time. The perception in public was that there are at least half of the Slovenian public is against the NATO. Because the critics of NATO at that time in Slovenia were much more vocal. They have better channels and they better use them. This was the perception. Then we had a referendum, the results were there, and the results were 2/3 for NATO and close to 90% for the European Union. Then in years 2010, 11, 12, in Slovenia, we have very strong voices. What would we call them today? Maybe fake news campaign, disinformation campaign, etc. In your old socialist terminology, it would be called agitprop, agitation and propaganda, which is basically the same, only the tools change through the decades. Saying that Slovenian soldiers shouldn't participate in Afghanistan. You all remember this being in Slovenia. And Slovenia was very specific within the all new NATO member states, where those voices were so strong that even on the polls, 80 to 90% of Slovenian people were against Slovenian participation in NATO mission in Afghanistan. So we decided also to make a new poll in 2018, late 2018, and ask the same questions to Slovenian public in regards to NATO European Union as it was asked in 2003 at the referendum. And the results, and this really shocked me, were basically almost the same as in 2003. So the support for NATO was identical, and for European Union was even, I think, 5% more. So we are 90+% convinced Europeans in Slovenia, and 2/3 convinced NATO members. And to put all this together, I would just like to say that campaigning in Montenegro, when I was doing that for NATO membership in 2015-16, being advisor to the Ministry of Defense of Montenegro, for them, being a NATO member was very simple. Being a NATO member meant to them having a protection for national security, for national independence, for sovereignty, that no country would occupy them again. And I would like to bring this back to the Western Balkans. Yes, NATO has to address all the three things I mentioned from the start, but it has to project the power and the values to the Western Balkans. Slovenia, as you all know, helped strongly to Croatia, to Montenegro, to Northern Macedonia, and it's in Slovenian, regional, European, and NATO's best interest to bring them all into the NATO alliance.
Thank you, Damir. Let's go back to the note. Sven, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I actually want to add some thoughts on the artificial intelligence issue. First, and really to make it sure that we understand what we talk about. I think mostly people talk about the narrow, specific AI. If we talk about the general, comprehensive one, what Putin was talking about, then it is, I think, certain that this machine will rule the world, but we do not know whether it wants humans to be around anymore or not. Because then we talk about a very different issue, what is sometimes called the technological singularity, when basically when you invent something which is wiser than humankind, but goes at many million times the speed of humankind, then humans will be done with very quickly. Mostly we talk about narrow AI, and what you need for that are three things. You need data, you need algorithms, and you need computational power. And this is the big struggle of this generation, I think, in terms of world supremacy. And where we are on that, and it's mostly between US and China, and Europe is, let's say, in the third place. First, on data, this is a challenge for the democratic nations, because in China, they just take data. You have heard about social credit system. I may be exaggerating a bit, but not much. Basically, if you take too much toilet paper in a public lavatory, your social credit system would suffer. And eventually, you would not be able to book a hotel, have a bank account, and so forth, or get a flight ticket. In Europe, especially, the privacy laws are supreme. And hence, of course, access to data is problematic. It's better in US because US, the GAFA, the big companies, they have a lot of data. Second, algorithms, and here we really talk about research, top-level research. Here, China is increasing in terms of volume of research very quickly, and is catching up the United States, but not catching up in terms of quality of research. There, US is reigning supreme, and Europe is doing much better also than China in terms of a top-tier AI research. Third, computational power, and here we talk about basically specialized chips. That's again where US is ahead, but we don't know for how long. So this is, I think, a challenge. This is basically very clearly and rightly said where Europe is lagging behind. And this is really, unfortunately, where democracies, where civil society are lagging behind. Because while China takes whatever data it wants, if it is not putting 1 million Uyghurs into concentration camps. Anyway, everything, all the data is theirs. At the same time, in Google, we see that there was a revolt among the employees when Google Corporation wanted to do a research jointly with Pentagon because of a peace nix. in among them. And of course, what would that mean? I mean, in terms of that struggle, I think it's not going to be a basically good result, unfortunately, long-term for us.
Thank you very much. Time has expired, but we will prolong the discussion. We have still 3 panelists, and Robert will be the next. I just will use this opportunity to mention, because many multilateral organizations were mentioned so far, NATO, EU, United Nations. Nobody mentioned OSCE, but Miroslav Lajčák is chairing OSCE till the end of this year. So if you want to add something, it's up to you, but the floor is yours.
Well, I don't want to speak on behalf of Miroslav Lajčák, but we are very happy to have him and as a Slovakia to be chairman of the OSCE this year. I wanted to say that I'm happy that I provoked such a debate on new technologies and AI, because it's absolutely important, because what we see is a return of great power competition, but this time on steroids. And these steroids are new technologies, simply. And while we are discussing artificial intelligence and what does it mean for us, other countries and other actors are integrating it already to their security systems. And we are here for the search of time. It's a competition for time. And we as democracies have a big disadvantage, because we have to reach compromise, and until we reach a compromise, it takes a lot of time. So really, we need to recognize that this is a challenge where we need to speed up our decision-making. We need to recognize that, and we need to recognize that that is the battle of today, not of tomorrow. Because just imagine all the technologies that are today already, and you are using it. GPS location, face recognition, drones, autonomous weapons. All of these, if you combine it, you create a sci-fi, but sci-fi that is now. Simply, I don't know if you've seen the video when a small group of criminals, because these technologies are often very accessible and are not as expensive, is just spreading 100 or 1,000 of these autonomous drones with face recognition, GPS location. It can hit you right away, your face, know where you are, without any casualties, any other casualties in the city. This is not a battle in 10, 20 years, actually. This is now. And you know what is the worst thing? If this happens, we will not know who the enemy is. And it will take us a year to debate who the enemy was. And the enemy will never admit that it was him. And that's where the politics needs to be even more agile. And we need to recognize this challenge that we are going to face. Thank you.
Thank you. Attribution is always a challenge, and especially if it is too late. It is actually too late, and we are losing the ground. We will continue with Scott Weber, French and American approach, W, if it is possible.
I'm feeling more French these days than American, I must say. The other panelists have said a lot of important things I was going to mention. I just want to focus on one issue, which is trust. And you're talking about the speed of change, and yet building trust takes time, right? Consulting takes time. How do you do this in a meaningful way, not in a superficial, gladiatory type entertainment way, but in a real, meaningful way? And I think that's where our political systems have not adapted to the reality that we do need to go faster, that there's not a 24-hour news cycle, a daily news cycle, it's a minute-to-minute news cycle where politicians have to react on the minute to what's going on. And I think that's the reality that we're in. So how do we build a society and a world in which we have greater trust? Because we're living a profound crisis of trust. We had an economic crisis clearly, which then generated a social crisis. As a result, that generated a political crisis, but fundamentally underlying it all was a crisis of trust. Trust in institutions, as the Deputy Prime Minister said, trust in representational authority and governance, trust in our economic systems. It's a first generation whose kids are not going to improve their lives based compared to their parents. I mean, this is what we're living at the moment. And I want to come back to our young colleague on the panel and what he said, which is so fundamentally important, which is that, you know, it's not a question of them being included, youth being included. They don't want to be included in our systems. They want to change the system. And I think that's what we haven't quite understood yet, is that, you know, our director in New York was the lead author of the Youth, Peace and Security Report of the UN, another document you all have to read. Youth, Peace and Security Report of the UN, a fundamental document. But what it basically says is that young people are not waiting to be included. They're moving on. They're creating solutions. They're challenging the norms. And I think it's our challenge to actually catch up to them. So our political systems are not adapted to their inclusion, and that's the problem, is that we need systems that are going to have them at the table from day one on all questions. And that's what's going to create greater trust, the ability to get different constituencies to feel like they too have a voice, they too have a way of contributing, a way of participating. And right now, our systems are not adapted to that. So I think our biggest challenge in all of this is actually a crisis of trust, internal trust, trust, you know, horizontally between groups, and trust between the people and their authorities. And that, if we can solve that by changing our systems, having the creative courage to actually come up with new ways of organizing ourselves, I think we'll move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Emil, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your sentiment about youth, and I think that is kind of the way that we are feeling. We feel that, you know, what I think the way the human development has worked is that after the internet became, you know, pretty much a thing in every household, there became a divergence of generations, and we are what everyone now calls digital natives. You have now generations which are brought up with social media, which communicate in a different way. Humor related in memes that transcends borders and so on and so forth. And to relate to my other colleagues' remarks about technology, yes, procurements are slow, but if you have young people in your teams who understand that sphere, who understand the issues of today, they can provide a perspective. And it's not that we don't think that all the older generations cannot add value. I think it's a complementary thing. Your systematic understanding of the realities, which can sometimes maybe curb our ambition and enthusiasm, is extremely necessary. But our understanding of what is happening today is unrivaled and unparalleled, because we don't learn that, we live that. Tablets and so on and so forth. I'm embarrassed to say how many hours a day I spent on Instagram, but you know, that shapes my fashion sense, that shapes the music that I like, that shapes the vacations that I will take because of the sponsored posts. But ultimately, it also shapes my political views. My little bubble is formed there, and I think that, you know, you're all a part of it. It's just that we perceive it in a different way, and I do believe that we have a value added in this very, very complex dynamic that is the security role today. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all panelists. What we did, and we prolonged a little bit our period available, was creating a situation awareness, and we were progressing in reaching consensus. If we talk about global challenges, we simply need a global consensus on some challenges and priorities. And I will conclude by saying that I'm always shocked and surprised how many people don't know that the NATO adopt each and every decision on consensus. All 29, 30 members need to agree on everything if we want to do something. In many institutions, it would be mission impossible. But we are adopting constantly. We simply have to be up to date. We simply need to deliver. And if we want to deliver, we need to reach a consensus. I believe that we contributed a little bit to a consensus, what we need to do in the future. That's why I will use this opportunity not just to thank you to be with us all this time, but I would like to invite you and panelists to join us again next year on the next Bled Strategic Forum. Thank you very much.